Wonderful. I will start again by saying that this is the Civil Society and Global Sustainable Development Report event that Together 2030, CEPEI and World Vision has put together this morning. And specifically, we want to talk about the GSDR since its publication in 2019. The GSDR has become a benchmark for many of us working around the 2030 agenda, and specifically the GSDR is one of the essential tools we have found to promote the SDGs and to inform also policies and bring evidence forward to policymakers and decision takers. But it is also important to see how it is able to create synergies and to have a more holistic approach about the agenda for action and delivery. Therefore, we have the side event of the HLPF of Together 2030, where we have invited several guests that you are already seen on the screen, and some of them have sleepy eyes like myself because it's an early morning for them as well. First of all, good morning to you, Dana, John, Daniel, David. I hope you can all hear me and can give me a heads up so we can start actually this morning discussion with you. I see a first hands up. John, simply if you can give me a yes. Perfect. And Dana, a smile from you, so I know that you are online as well. Wonderful. So we are ready actually to get started, and I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is David Smith, who is a member of the independent group of scientists and a co-author of the GSDR. So David, you are actually in our hemisphere coming from Jamaica, and as a coordinator of the Institute for Sustainable Development at a very dear university for us in the region, the University of the West Indies. And also he is part of the University Consortium of Small Island States. And I actually could spend the time that we have reading his CV. But David, I believe it is easier to simply give you a good morning and a heads up in order to introduce yourself and also to have your 10 minutes. I simply, for the housekeeping, David and colleagues, David, you have 10 minutes to address the audience, and then I will give the other three speakers 7 minutes each to react and to give their intervention, so simply that you know how housekeeping rules are. And I will try my best to keep us in order in the time as well, since we don't want only a monologue, but we want our participants also to participate in this debate. So David, from Colombia over to Jamaica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. It's 7 o'clock here as well. And I've had my coffee, so I hope that I'll be able to keep everybody informed. The civil society played a very important role in the development of the Sustainable Development Report. There was, during the development of the report, we put out a call to academia, to civil society, and to business to give us examples of good practice from around the world that we could use to highlight or to draw lessons from that would allow us to tell the world about what was going on well and what was, in some cases, not going so well. And we got an overwhelming response. Hundreds of people sent in examples which we were able to use in the report and be able to pull that together. And this ranged from ways in which people were working with government. There were partnerships between businesses and government, partnerships between NGOs and academia, and that helped a lot. And I think it's very important to recognize that if we are going to achieve the goals, and there is an if there, it's not certain that we will achieve the goals. We know that we are moving ahead in some areas, but we are unfortunately moving slowly in other areas, and even worse, in some areas we're moving backwards. And part of the reason for that is that the goals are interlinked in sometimes complicated and complex ways. And if we try to simply pursue a single goal, it's very likely that we will end up with problems caused by the interlinkages, which may stop us from moving forward. And so we need to look at the goals in a slightly different way, or completely different way in some cases, of the way that we've looked at development problems in the past. let's remember the context. There are four major problems which we identified in the Sustainable Development Report as being inimical to human well-being. One is waste, one is inequality, one is climate, and one is the loss of biological diversity. Often we tend to focus only on one or maybe two of these areas, and we do need to bear in mind that all four of these are extremely important problems, and we have to try to address all of them if we are going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals in the time that we wish to meet them. The thing is that these problems aren't problems for everybody. So there are winners and losers in this. It's going to be hard to read, but I'll try to get it circulated through the organizers later on. It's a table which is a list of the 100 biggest entities on the planet as measured by the amount of revenue that they took in, I think back in 2015. The green ones are countries. The blue ones are companies. It's interesting that the 10th largest is not a country, it's Walmart. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because income tends to tie in with power. And so many of our countries, including the country that I live in, it doesn't appear anywhere on this list, they don't have the level of income that many companies do. And that means if there are going to be discussions about how one pursues development, some countries or many countries are quite at a disadvantage when it comes to negotiating with many of the corporate entities in the world. And many of the countries in the world are very, very small in terms of income compared to countries, which means that those countries are walking into agreements and walking into negotiations from a position of weakness. There are also, of course, losers, and losers because of climate change. So we can see the problems of floods, we can see the problems of refugees, we can see the problems even within developed countries of inequality where people feel that they are marginalized, they're taking to the streets, they're saying, well, you know, we are having problems. We've seen, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement starting, of course, in the United States, but spreading throughout the world where people feel that they are being unfairly discriminated against and sometimes killed because of the color of their skin. Inequality leads to social unrest, and inequality stops us from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And then, of course, you have climate problems such as hurricanes, which we've seen an increase of in terms of their size and their destruction. We said in the report that rather than try to go after each goal individually, we should focus on 6 main areas. One has to do with human well-being, which is, of course, the whole point of sustainable development. It's to increase human well-being. We need sustainable and just economies. Currently, our economies are not sustainable or just, and we're seeing that being emphasized by the recent COVID crisis. Since COVID has uncovered an awful lot that's wrong with what's going on, and an awful lot that's wrong with business as usual. Access to energy and the ability to find energy to be able to carry on your life. So even everything from cooking food to be able to driving a car or get from one place to another. Food and nutrition systems. If we wanted to try to feed everybody in the world by using the current agricultural systems and simply scaling them up, we would not be able to do it. We would create global collapse by doing so. If we want to feed the world, then we have to change the agricultural systems to more sustainable systems that don't involve, for example, removing vast amounts of rainforest, which are providing us with important biological diversity, or if by cutting them down, we're contributing to climate change. Then there are the ways that we manage our cities and the development around our cities and the global environmental commons. All those things which contribute to human well-being, which we can't do without, which aren't necessarily owned by individuals, such as the oceans and the atmosphere. We suggest that there are levers which are very important, cross-cutting, that should be applied to each problem, and that is science and technology, individual and collective action, economy and finance, and governance. And without all 4 of those being applied to most of the problems, we're not likely to move forward. There are, for each area, even though we're suggesting you enter the entry points of transformation, that they're the same and that the levers are the same, the precise pathways are going to vary from one country to the next and from one problem to the next. The last point I want to make has to do with the way in which problems have been looked at before. We've solved many of our simple problems. Those are the problems where we know what we want and we know enough about the system to be able to figure out how to do it. We are working a lot on complicated problems. That is where we know enough about the system, but we haven't quite agreed on the values and the outcomes that we want. And we're also working on problems which are complex, where we don't know enough about the system yet, but we know what we want to solve. For example, COVID. But we have a problem with what we refer to as wicked problems, which are those problems which we don't know enough about the underlying system, and we haven't agreed on our values with regard to that problem yet. And many of the problems that we're going to encounter as we move towards the Sustainable Development Goals are wicked problems, and that requires a different way of approaching them. We may not be able to solve those problems, but we need multidisciplinary approaches to be able to address those problems. We need to not so much focus on our individual specialities, but find ways to bring the specialities of different actors together and address these inherently complicated, complex, and wicked problems in a somewhat different way than the way we've been doing it in the past. So this isn't where we call up the engineer and say, you're the best engineer, go and solve that problem. This is where we try to figure out how can we get the engineers, how can we get the NGOs, how can we get government, private sector, social scientists, natural scientists to put all their skills together at addressing a problem. And that's difficult. Many of us as experts have not been taught how to work with other experts. Many of us as experts don't appreciate the expertise of other experts. And in some cases, don't think that it's expertise at all. So we have to get over ourselves in one sense, but learn to appreciate and also work effectively with other people from completely different sectors, working across government, academia, business, and civil society. I think, though, civil society probably has a very good role to play that can allow civil society a convening power, because civil society can act neutrally politically and can work with anybody they choose. And I think that role that they can play, the role that could be maybe of a broker and the convener, is extremely important, and they may have an added advantage over and above, say, government or business, to be able to bring people together to marry those disciplines and to address problems in a transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary way, approaching it through a different lens, but with the overarching objective that what we are trying to do in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is to improve human well-being in whatever situation we find it. And I believe, having worked in an NGO, that this is possible. I'll leave you with a lovely line which a government colleague of mine said to me once. She said, David, the reason I work with you is because as an NGO, you have access to funding that I cannot get, and you are able to do things that I cannot do. And that's why I work with you. I thought it was a very nice way of putting it, and helped me to understand what the value of my NGO to that government department was. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for these insights, which were not only quite enlightening, but also helpful, what you just said at the end about the brokering and convening role of civil society. We will have now discussant, David and colleagues, who will actually react not only to what the work of the scientists has been on the GSDR, but also addressing those issues as the winners of losers that you were mentioning as well, the roles of science and how you have that multidisciplinary approach, and especially how we are able as civil society to work holistically together. I mean, that has been said so many times, it sounds so beautiful in the discourse, but now we will hear from several experts that actually are engaging and seeing how to make sense of all of this into practice. So we will hear first from Dana, Dana, and I excuse myself not telling your last name because I want to give you a head start with the right foot. But Dana is the international leader for advocacy and international engagement of World Vision. And Dana, I don't know if you're sitting right now in Bucharest in Romania or somewhere else hiding from the COVID pandemic. Please give us a heads up because the floor is yours now to react to David's presentation and of course to bring your vision very closely on issues like child and youth within the report that you found or have not found yet, because as I have heard, you have studied the report very much from the length of your interest. So please give us a heads up and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philip, and what an amazing presentation. Thank you, David. So my name is Dana Buzducea, and I'm actually sitting in Bucharest, Romania, despite COVID that is affecting us all. And today I want to start my reflections with the words of Nelson Mandela, who said that if we want any significant development, we must co-opt the civil society. Because we are living in a context when the force of this pandemic demonstrated just how interconnected, but also how fragile the humanity really are. So I believe that it is now more than ever the role of the civil society to speak about those realities of those that are the most left behind. The people living in injustice or poverty, just as we have seen in David's images, those who are discriminated, those who are living invisible drama as children experiencing abuse, or even the helplessness of a parent who just saw the family income vanishing. And we know from every crisis that the biggest toll will be paid by the most vulnerable. And as civil society, we need to be very serious in bringing our unique set of skills to the table, such as our capacity to reach out to the most vulnerable in the hardest to reach places, or the way we can use the evidence to influence the policy change. And at World Vision, we are very intentional in building the evidence that is not only relevant, appropriate, and timely, but even more importantly, that evidence that is inclusive, and it brings the authentic voices of the people, families, and communities, including the children, voices of children, that we are trying to support. Civil society opens spaces for constructive dialogue. Exactly as David said earlier, we can bring together citizens to create citizens-driven actions that would generate pragmatic and timely solutions to a community problem. And we need to continue to channel the relevant and scientifically proven solutions to those places where they are most needed. So in this context, obviously, we were very interested in the global report because it brings together a wide range of scientific analysis to take stock of the SDGs progress, and it places a spotlight on the importance of science and policy interface as critical to tackle the global challenges. And at this HLPF, we have a unique opportunity to pause and to reflect on our strong evidence-based efforts and the proposition to articulate and harmonize between science and policy. And in order to do so, from a civil society perspective, obviously we need to review what the global report offers to accelerate progress on SDGs, particularly for the most vulnerable population, including the children, the young people, or the women, and to name just a few. And we need to participate in this discussion because the proposition in the report is informing the decade of action and delivery. So consequently, it informs the implementation and the achievement of the SDGs. It is setting, therefore, the follow-up and the review framework for the HLPF and the forthcoming cycle. World Vision, as an organization that is focused on the rights and the well-being of children, looked at how the GSDR is addressing children as one of the most vulnerable populations that is often left behind. And as a key question for us was how the report's proposition can help governments and stakeholders to deliver for the children in achieving the 2030 agenda. And while overall children receive a significant deal of attention in the report in relation to specific areas such as the under 5 mortality, the education, the intergenerational wealth or poverty, there are other areas where we see significant less coverage. And several references to children that appear in the 2030 agenda and the SDGs are actually not being mentioned in the GSDR, including some aspects regarding the transportation systems, but even child soldiers or access to safe and green public spaces, trafficking, violence, and even torture. So despite the above, we think the strength of the report is in flagging the alarm on those development gains that are at risk and those that we are lagging behind. And in the context of COVID that impacted all of us and the children in particular, and I'll mention why we think that alarm should be even clearer and louder than ever. At World Vision, we're very concerned that the effects of COVID-19 will permanently scar a whole generation of the most vulnerable children in the world. Because our analysis keeps finding new and disturbing areas of concerns. For example, in our first aftershocks report, we found that the secondary effects of the pandemic will put about 30 million children at risk of disease and death. In our second report, we looked at violence against children, and we warned that up to 85 million more children could be affected by violence in the upcoming months, as the vital isolation measures forced them to stay at home. And in the third and latest report that was released just this week and that will be presented tomorrow in our side event, we have been looking at the impact that's plummeting the incomes of families, forcing millions of children to go hungry, or to beg, or to work, or to be forced into child marriage even. In a survey that we conducted with young leaders around the world, we found that 3/4 of them, of children and young people, feel isolated and lonely because of COVID, with obvious potential impact on the mental health. So these are reflections that I wanted to bring to today's discussion as an important point, because the grouping of the SDGs into the 6 entry points and the fact that there are some gaps in addressing children as a vulnerable population entails a significant risk that the governments, when they are implementing this complex agenda, might risk to overlook the totality of children's rights and only address few of them. And we also want to focus on the opportunities that the entry points and call to action offer to children. These opportunities focus on identifying the gaps to enable addressing those most complementary. So I look forward to hearing from the great panelists, and I want to thank together 2030 and CEPEI for inviting us to this very important conversation, and I'm looking forward to learning today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, for your reflections. They have helped us to have a first glimpse on how actually, David, several stakeholders are seeing your report and actually making sense of it. I will go back to you later on in the discussion, but first of all, we would like to hear from 2 more colleagues, which are actually in New York, holding the line for all of us that doesn't make it this year to the HLPF. John, first of all, good morning to you. I hope you can hear us fine. I will give you the floor in one moment, but first of all, I would like to introduce you. John is the coordinator of the TAP network, and everybody that is acquainted with accountability and transparency know the colleagues of TAP, and they have worked very much around SDG 16, and John has been leading this process. So we wanted to hear from him and the reflections of the TAP network around the report, and especially how what they have found, because they have also studied the report in depth. So John, give us your reflections right away. You have your 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, Philip. Yeah, I think, yeah, as Philip mentioned, the TAP network, we work on SDG 16 on a thematic level, on the issues around SDG 16, and also on accountability for the 2030 agenda. So my reflections will be framed through that lens, as I'm sure you can imagine. I think just in general, in terms of overall reflections on the GSDR, I think, especially in today's times, I think the focus on the science and the facts and the data, I think are more important than ever, especially in this era of fake news and times where facts are sometimes subjective and opinions are just as valuable as facts in some people's eyes. I think this focus on science is really much needed. And I think it does a really great job of analyzing where some of the touch points are in particular for where we need transformation. I think the reference to a transformative agenda, I think sometimes is, I think it's a little bit tokenistic. I think the focus on how we transform societies, especially in today's times with COVID-19, we talk about the need to build back better and build back differently and establish a new normal. I think the focus on that transformation and the levers and entry points for that transformation is hugely important. I think in general terms also, we're happy to see that the GSDR also has specific calls to action. I think especially when it comes to a big global report like this that aggregates a ton of different inputs. I think sometimes it's difficult to come to agreement on where those areas are. So I obviously don't envy the job that the authors of the report had in front of them. It's a monumental task. I think to bring everything together was, yeah, I think it was a great effort. I think also highlighting, you know, as David had highlighted, the multidisciplinary approach is also important. And again, I think sometimes the references to, you know, the need for partnership and the need for including civil society, I think again is a little bit tokenistic when it comes to, you know, the discussions around the HLPF and, you know, around the implementation of the SDGs in this decade of action. So I think the focus on the need for utilizing all stakeholders to be a key part of this transformation, again, it was also encouraging. You know, obviously coming from the SDG 16 lens as well, we were also encouraged that the focus on governance as one of the 4 levers for sustainable development was included as well. I mean, I think, again, especially in today's times, the focus on governance is as important as it's ever been. I mean, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed a lot of the cracks in governance systems, particularly at the national and local level, where governments need to be more responsive to the needs of citizens. And I think, you know, I think there is a correlation between good governance and how strong institutions and governance systems are, and it correlates directly with the effectiveness of the response to COVID-19 in many countries thus far. I think we've seen a lot of countries with good governance systems and a good responsive government to these challenges from COVID-19 have done better, I think, in very broad terms in the response to COVID-19. But I think the focus on governance, again, more important than ever, but especially when it comes to building back better, as we say, but also to strengthening resiliency of our societies collectively going forward. I think, again, something that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed is the fact that we haven't invested in governance and institutions over years and decades, even in many cases. And I think, again, the pandemic has, I think in a lot of ways, it's only exposed the cracks in society. I mean, I think the report outlines where these cracks may be as of last year. But I think what we're seeing with the pandemic is that these aren't new things that have just come into the forefront because of the pandemic. I think these have been emerging cracks in societies over years and decades. But I think, again, it's exposing these cracks and widening and deepening these cracks in societies where I think, what I hope is that this might be a catalyst for us as societies and for governments, governance systems and institutions to say, yes, you know, these are inherent crises. These have been slow burning crises up to this point. And we need to do better at being more responsive to emerging crises like this, whether it's a sudden onset of a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic or a slow burning crisis, no pun intended, for around climate change, for example. And I think, you know, when it comes to the GSDR in particular, you know, it does provide some insights on where progress is. Sorry?
Oh. 1 minute.
Yep. And then basically, yeah, what I was going to wrap up and say is that it's encouraging that, you know, that it showcases where progress is or where there is a lack of progress. But I think the focus on accountability going forward also should be highlighted as well. And especially in the call to action. So we would have liked to see a little bit more there, but to help fill some of those gaps, Together 2030 and the TAP network are part of what we call the Campaign for a Decade of Accountability for the SDGs. It's really simple to find more information. It's sdgaccountability.org/decade. And one thing that we'll be doing as a partnership is producing what we call the Global SDG Accountability Report, which will provide a snapshot on how global accountability is in current times and how we can improve accountability for the 2030 agenda. There's a lot more. You can find it on our website. I'll let you unpack that a bit further on your own. But just to say, I think that's also an important part of this going forward is the accountability piece, particularly from a civil society perspective.
Thanks, John, and thanks for those thoughts where we heard words like tokenistic, the focus on governance, and specifically filling the gaps. That was the last part of your intervention, John, that I will believe that will help us now in the discussion, because the decade of action and accountability in order to deliver will be, of course, something we have to measure the report as well. And that's something where our last speaker will also focus on, which is Daniel Perrell, who I believe is sitting as well in New York. He's the representative to the United Nations from the Baha'i international community, and he is also very much involved in the major groups process. So Daniel, the floor is yours for the next 7 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Philip, and thank you everyone for getting up early this morning and joining all of us in this very important conversation. I have my timer going. I think it'll be 7 minutes and 10 seconds, so we'll see how I do. So let's start with a couple of acknowledgements about this report before getting into the 3 main points. So the first is that the GSDR has advanced the conversation in some really important ways. It tries to strengthen linkages between science and policy making, a link that is often assumed to be far stronger than it really is. And it tries to use science as a system of knowledge, which can then inform humane policymaking. I don't think all scientific reports do this. And this is also in contrast to the risk that we see playing out today when people in positions of power and leadership sort of ignore science in favor of political calculations. This report cautions against that. Second, the report is unique because it's shaped the HLPF. I don't know of another recent example when a scientific report has determined the structure of a UN meeting. We should commend both the authors and the UN and, in fact, the member states for this. And third is just my summary of what the GSDR should really stand for, and I'm putting it in the chat box. People say it's the Global Sustainable Development Report, but to me, it's really, if you're going with silos, you're doing it wrong. So that aside, my actual points for this conversation today, again, come in three. So I'll focus on thought, on speech, and on action. And these three elements in many ways define what it is to be human. And a good book, a good report, or a good film will impact all three. So the GSDR should do just that for civil society. So beginning with thought. Development on any issue is not a siloed activity. It has broader impacts, both positive and negative, that must always be considered. Reinforce the good and approach the harmful with caution and wisdom. This means we need to be constantly thinking of the nuance of our activities, questioning the impacts one endeavor has on another, which leads us to moving beyond the silos. This narrative of silos is comfortable, and this self-narrative of silos is comfortable. I work on women's rights, I work on climate, I work on taxation, and while categories and classifications are important, this way of thinking should not veil us from the interconnected nature of the lived reality. And while a degree of specialization matters, some of the most helpful insights into a particular reality might be gained from participation in another area. Finally, we must recognize that development is not linear, nor is it simply material. And I think this is an important assumption that is questioned in the report. And just to unpack that a little bit, I often get the chills when people reference Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Not because I disagree entirely, but because I worry that once that comes up, we run the risk of saying, oh, you can't have love or belonging or esteem or these other issues until you have your physiological needs met. And I think this is a dangerous proposition in the lived experiences of those who are traditionally the assumed beneficiaries of development. Of course, we need to get food for the starving, but we also need to create loving communities regardless of material security. So second is the point on speech. What the GSDR does is it helps us to nuance both how we talk about the SDGs and how we convey our asks to those who are policymakers. In talking about them, we should be careful about how we identify which goal we work on, and this risk was outlined above. In terms of the work of policymakers, one issue I've found is that many ministries see their work as, again, one specific thing. But this report shows us that the expertise developed in one issue area finds its greatest value when it's understood in the context of an interconnected system. This means that in our advocacy, civil society has a much stronger case to make for ministries to find ways to learn and work together. We shouldn't see ourselves as competing. Now, finally, we shouldn't see ourselves as competing for resources or trying to advance one agenda over another, but rather how, in focusing on our respective areas, our goals can achieve a shared ambition. So the GSDR, plain and simple, provides us with ample research and findings which should enter into our discourse so that we can express the importance of these interlinkages. It can help narrow the gap between the high rhetoric of mutually reinforcing SDGs and establish patterns of behavior and interaction that actually reflect this interconnectedness. And it gives us a way to speak to the general public about sustainable development. It puts the SDGs through the real life lens, which is really helpful. The 17 colored boxes are great as a visual, but this report tries to take the whole person and the whole of society into account, which I think is far more inclusive. Now, finally, on our action, the GSDR can serve as a roadmap both for civil society and governments and donors of all kinds to increase our sophistication. The NGO sector is largely siloed. There's a funder with a project they want to fund or an NGO who writes a grant, and both are really bound by largely material conditionalities, which restricts our ability to refine actions over time. This report tells us that this approach is limited at best, and it doesn't reflect the complexity of the human being and our world. And this tension between metrics and people is something we need to be constantly questioning in our activities. And it speaks, in fact, to why and how data can truly be useful. So the reality is that linear thinking about one thing impacting another with a limited collateral effect is dismissed by this report. We now have a framework that reflects the complexity of development and allows us to apply some kind of correspondingly sophisticated rubric to the challenges we face. So in our actions, we should do our best to avoid any exclusionary approach, whether it's exclusive to groups of people or even to certain types of issues. Now, don't confuse this with avoiding specialization. Specialization is vital, but to do so without context would be like continually strengthening an arm without recognizing how it's connected to the rest of the body. So next is the reality that development is something that everyone can be doing in our choices as an employer or employee, producer, consumer, borrower, or lender. The GSDR takes an expansive view of the development project, and it forces us to avoid this paternalistic attitude often taken by those like myself who are considered developed. It should likewise cause us to recognize where there's dissonance in our own lives. I live in a house with a yard. So does my lifestyle comport with the consumption patterns that are required today? Am I purchasing the right kind of clothing? how consistent am I in my ideals and my lived reality? So the last and most important thing the GSDR helps us to do is conceive of our efforts not as projects, but as processes. The report states that it is, quote, not only a product, but also a process for advancing collaboration among actors in science. So like the trial and error central to any advancement, whether it's the child learning to walk or the scientist in the lab, our path will involve setbacks and false starts. But what is most important is the persistence and dedication to a process of learning in the search for solutions. This process orientation, rather than program orientation, must be the spirit that guides our work going forward. So process thinking says that any experience is a useful data point, and let us use it as a moment to learn. This is a key lesson from the GSDR that can be applied to our development work and in fact to our lives. So thank you very much, Philipp and all.
Wonderful. The pandemic has made us even more efficient. You were under your 7 minutes, Daniel, so wonderful. And thank you as well. You have been asked already in the chat that your interventions could be shared as well. Benjamin Kickert has yes asked that. And now it's actually the fun part of a virtual meeting, which is getting our participants into the discussion. I would like to give the floor to those that are raising their hands. And also you can make your questions to any of the four panelists via the chat, which I will be reading out and giving them forward to them. Please make sure to address it specifically to one of the participants, mention your name, and this is a Q&A session, so please be aware of time and do not do interventions that are longer than the speakers have made. So please, I will open up the floor to those that are raising their hands for questions or comments. So from the participants, and Arelis, if you can help me as well to see who is raising their hands and wanting to raise a question.
I think in this setup that we have, they have to write the questions. They have to write the questions in the Q&A box. There is a Q&A box right next to participants, so they can write the questions there.
Wonderful. I have just received several messages that I have not read well my notes on the Q&A part, so thank you for doing this. Well, very much. Let me go to the first question then, David, and this is addressed to you from Selina Manson from Argentina. She's asking how the GSDR main findings could help to face the COVID-19 effects at the national and regional as well as global levels. I would like you to stick to these questions for a second, because I would like to read out two more so that we can actually get this conversation going. I have here another one from Dayar Sakar, who is, I think GSDR is not able to consider gender equality and political dimensions of development. Can David clarify? So those are two questions to you very specifically, David, but I would like to go back as well, first of all, to Daniel and John, who has both mentioned how this report has shaped the HLPF. And I would like a little bit more insights from your side about this and how actually it has shaped the HLPF. And going back to Dana as well, addressing a very important question. You mentioned key questions that were not addressed in the report, and I would like to hear from you at least one or two of those key questions that we could bring into the discussion once again in order to shape the discussion in the future. So over to you, first of all, David, and then I will read out further comments or questions that we are receiving. So please, David, over to you.
Okay, thank you. The first question related to COVID and the way in which maybe the approach described in the GSDR may help us with the COVID crisis. I'll use an example. If you look at the islands of the Caribbean, the islands that did best or are doing best at the moment in terms of keeping the numbers of cases and deaths low are not the islands that have the highest GDP per capita, nor are they the islands which have the largest or smallest populations. If you look at the comparison, if we take, for example, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, and make comparisons between the two countries that are about equal size. That would be Jamaica and Puerto Rico versus Cuba and República Dominicana. Cuba is doing much better than the Dominican Republic, very much better. There are maybe 10 times more deaths in the Dominican Republic than Cuba. Similarly, Puerto Rico has at least 10 times the number of deaths in Jamaica. What is it that marks them apart? It's very clear that in the countries that did well, and I will also include for comparison Costa Rica, the government took the advice of its professionals, usually in the Ministry of Health, and acted on them quickly and made sure that individual and collective action of the citizens followed that advice. So they locked things down, they closed airports, they made sure that public gatherings over a particular size were not allowed. So they followed the evidence and they ensured that people knew what was going on and knew what they had to conform to. In those cases where they did not do as well, they either acted later or did not, for example, shut down airports and various other things and allowed economic considerations sometimes to trump what was being advised by the health people. So I think the basic advice would be that we, in a situation where we are troubled by a pandemic, regardless of the kind of pandemic, and there are numerous ones which we will need to be aware of, science is important and should form the basis of the kinds of actions that our governments take, should form the basis of actions that our citizens take as well. So that would be one point. And then I think there was a question about gender and whether or not the report adequately addresses gender. That's a good question. It's not the first time that question has been raised. I know that when we made several presentations both at the HLPF and at other meetings, the question of gender was raised. I think you're probably right. We could probably have added more about gender and addressed gender in other ways as well. We do point out that there is a need to address gender imbalance in science. And I think we, as academic institutions, as institutions that may be government that interact with research, we do need to make sure that we are paying proper attention to gender in science, that we are not discriminating against people because of their gender, and that we are making sure that opportunities are open, because we have a gender inequality problem in science, as in many other sectors. But if you look at the majority of science, if you will, you'll find a couple of things. One is the majority of science tends to be done in OECD countries, and also that the ratio of men to women in many scientific fields, in employment, in research institutions and so on, is still biased heavily towards men, and we do need to address that. We are undoubtedly missing out on various aspects of science because of this, and we need to address that.
And yeah, David, those were your two questions. In order that I will give now the other participants or panelists the possibility to answer. David, in order for wrapping up, since we have 10 minutes left, your last remarks, which are important to us on the way forward, very specifically on the engagement in the multi-stakeholder engagement on the way forward, since things have changed quite dramatically when you were writing the report and what we are facing today. So if you could give us your vision, and if also the group has now got together again working on the COVID response and how it is affecting actually your findings that you presented last year.
I am very concerned that at the moment we're still partway through the COVID crisis, and what is happening is, of course, that different countries are getting infected at different times and there are different spreads. I'm very concerned that we haven't yet paid enough attention to what will happen in lesser developed countries that do not have the option, such as many of the small island states do, of simply saying, we will shut the airport. Being able to shut your airport is a very powerful thing. And it means that you can cut the number of infections. But there are a lot of countries with relatively weak governance mechanisms, relatively weak access to science that will not have that option. And we had raised the point of access to science and inequality of access to science several times in the GSDR. That is going to affect very adversely, I believe, what happens as the virus spreads through less developed countries, and also as it spreads within those people who are less fortunate, who are at the in cases of poverty and so on, within countries that may be doing better. So the inequality aspect is going to be, I think, something that we critically have to address. I worry, for example, that when the vaccine is found, that the time it takes to trickle down to rural poor people in, say, sub-equatorial Africa will be ridiculously long, because we've seen that sort of thing in many other situations. So we do, as a world community, need to recognize very clearly that particularly with pandemics, everybody is equal in terms of the way they are susceptible and they can pass on the virus, but we need to make sure that we recognize those inequalities when we come to treating the situation, and make sure that we take that into account and roll out our measures to those who would not otherwise be connected. And that to me is one of my major concerns, is that we will miss out on the rural poor, and that we will suffer as a result. We will probably miss out on the urban poor as well, and they and us will suffer as a result.
David, thanks for all of the remarks and very, very insights presentation as well. Simply to give you some good news, since you mentioned low and middle income countries, the Secretary General's office, through the multi-state trust fund, multi-donor trust fund, has just opened a new data and innovation platform, which is a multi-stakeholder platform run by thousands of institutions in order to help now in 47 countries to the United Nations system in order to providing data analysis, real-time predictions, and also the possibility of geocoded financial flows to see that the money is really going to those institutions and executed effectively. Simply to mention that I can give more information about this also through you and to the colleagues. And David, please, Cristina Diaz has a question for you. Since time is wrapping up, if you could read it and hopefully give her an answer through the chat, that would be grateful. And I would give now the floor to Dana, to that question that I was asking you to make and to leave in the room on the way forward. So Dana, over to you.
We do believe that there is so much in the report that can be built on, definitely. And we also believe that there are significant social issues that need to be considered carefully. I was referring to violence against children, for example, because we know that even before this pandemic, we had over 1 billion children who were, in a way or another, suffering from violence every year. So we are going to see that, and the cascading effects of violence in childhood are very well documented. We have the scientific evidence of both what is generating for the child, but also the longer term consequences for the society, from the health costs and the social integration and socioeconomic potential of the child. So from our perspective, these kinds of issues also need to be, continue to be addressed. Similarly, it is one of the wicked problems, probably, people living in the fragile contexts. We cannot ignore them. If the Agenda 2030 will be realized, it will have to leave no one behind. And they are unfortunately an increasing and increasingly vulnerable group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. And in order to keep the discussion going, we also have questions from Anna Söderström, who is asking us if there's a forum as an ongoing over time where civil society could interact with the GSDR scientists and other CSOs. I will give the floor now to John and Daniel, but David, if you have that answer ready for us, if that is a forum that it's ongoing or there are enabling environments in order for civil society to interact with the scientists that are leading this process. So I would leave that as a last intervention in order to wrap up. John and Daniel, very quickly to you about shaping HLPF and how this report has helped us and how could it actually trigger the future scenarios. Gentlemen, since I cannot say even ladies first, so you have to decide now who goes first.
All right, Daniel's pointing at me, so I've been called out. All right. Yeah, thanks, Philip. Yeah, I think in terms of how it should shape the HLPF, maybe I'll speak to that, is that I think a lot of the concepts, outlined in the GSDR, especially because they're based on scientific analysis, and really talk about bringing things together. I really do think that the focus on the holistic approach, and as Daniel mentioned before, is getting ourselves out of these silos. I mean, the SDGs are inherently re-siloing these issues into silos once again, and only exacerbating this issue even further. I think hopefully what we can do through future HLPFs, and I think that's largely dependent on the HLPF review process that member states will undertake next year. It's been pushed back to next year now. I think it's important for member states and civil society to explore the concrete ways that we can come out of those silos. Christina Diaz also provided a question in the Q&A about how do we reach people that are traditionally not reached by these global level discussions. I think that's going to be the important part of any HLPF going forward, is how do we make sure that, yes, we're coming together as a global community and aggregating our thoughts and how we move forward, but how do we not lose sight and how do we not lose the richness of the inputs that come from the national and local level, including from citizens who are experiencing the progress that we're supposed to be seeing from the SDGs. And I think the GSDR can hopefully help guide us to make sure that that's a more integrated and inclusive discussion. That's my hope, at least.
So I'll try to be very brief, Philip. Just to say that the GSDR has impacted the HLPF. If you look at the program, it tracks the 6 main areas, or the 6 impact areas that are outlined in the GSDR. And I think this is just the first step. I mean, the hope is that ultimately that recognition impacts policy and impacts practice. But first you have to start with this, hi, we're the UN and we have a tendency to silo. And once that is acknowledged and they can move beyond that, I think that's a really helpful thing in and of itself. The question is really, what is the next step? So it was really looking backwards. It has had a nominal impact, like in name, in terms of how things are put on that program. And hopefully it will have a lasting impact in thought and then in action. I just wanted to say about this dialogue with the GSDR authors. I think it's a fantastic idea. We did host, the Baha'i International Community did host alongside DESA last year one event where we had some of the scientists speak. It was kind of a civil society launch of the report. As you all know, there was this little pandemic that got in the way of continuing that process, but the hope is actually to continue that kind of ongoing dialogue and engagement. And it's really nice to have that encouragement from folks in this space to know that it is actually an important one, an important dialogue to have. And, again, silver lining on this situation of everybody being remote is we know that Zoom is possible. And so I think it won't be as hard to set up these meetings in the future, and I'll add it to the task list to consult on with DESA going forward for our organization or any others to take out. So thanks.
Thank you, Daniel, and John as well. Well, I'm seeing now the chat room, who is becoming quite active, and we could go on now for another hour, but time is actually up, and we have to virtually run, I believe, to quite a lot of other events. But for Together 2030 and also World Vision and CEPEI, it has been not only a pleasure, but an enriching morning where we have heard, an hour discussion from scientists, civil society, and also advocates bringing forward those ideas. And for further notice, we will be sharing all presentations and information we have talked about today. The organizers will take care of that. And to all of you, a good day, and please stay safe. Bye-bye from Cali, Colombia. Ciao.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Ciao, ciao.
Thanks for attending.
Thank you.